The night smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. That particular kind of pressure in the air. Thick, electric, sitting just behind your temples like a warning you couldn't quite translate into words. The kind of night where the sky turns a deep, bruised purple at the edges, and the streetlights flicker in that almost rhythmic way that makes you feel like the city itself is breathing too hard. Margaret Acaffer walked the same 3 blocks she always walked. 12-hour shift at County General, 3rd floor, trauma ward. She had done it so many times that her feet knew the cracks in the sidewalk before her eyes did. The particular dip near the pharmacy, the raised edge of concrete outside the laundromat where Mr. Petros still ran a load at 11 p.m. every Tuesday and Thursday, the faint chemical smell from the dry cleaner that was always there no matter what season it was. She was 51 years old. 5'4". She wore pale blue scrubs under a dark canvas jacket, and her natural hair was pulled back firmly, still pressed under the shape of where her surgical cap had sat for the better part of the night. Her shoes were the thick-soled nursing kind, white, scuffed, built for 12 hours of standing on hard tile floors. She walked with purpose. Not the rushed purpose of fear, but the quiet, economical purpose of someone who had learned long ago how to conserve every single calorie of energy. Beside her walked Duke. He was a Belgian Malinois. 4 years old, 72 pounds of muscle that moved like water, fluid, quiet, barely making a sound on the pavement. His ears were up. His eyes moved in slow, constant arcs. He wore a simple black harness, no patches, no markings, just a dog walking beside his person. To anyone who looked casually, he looked like a pet, a nice dog, maybe a little big. That was the thing about Duke. He didn't need to look like anything in particular. Margaret had gotten him 3 years ago, not long after she'd come back from her second consulting rotation with the Military Nursing Corps. She hadn't needed him for protection back then. She'd told herself she just wanted company. The apartment was quiet after 22 years of a life that was never quiet. Her daughter had moved to Portland. Her marriage had ended not in some dramatic explosion, but in the slow, sad, exhausted way that most long marriages end, like a fire that just ran out of wood. No fight, no villain. Just 2 people who had become strangers inside the same walls. Duke had been a gift from a former colleague. A man named Sergeant First Class David Reyes, who had trained military working dogs in Kandahar and later in Fort Bragg. He'd handed her the leash with the same directness he applied to everything. "He's retired from the program," Reyes had said. "He needs someone who knows how to be still." "I think that's you." Margaret had not told most people what she and Duke had actually been through together. She didn't see the point. People had a way of making those kinds of things into performances. Something to be impressed by, retold at dinner parties. She kept it in the same interior space where she kept everything that mattered most to her. Deep, still, accessible only when necessary. She turned the corner onto Delmer Street. The air shifted. Duke's head came up, not dramatically, just a millimeter, but Margaret felt it through the leash the same way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. She had learned to trust that signal absolutely. She slowed her walk by a single fraction. Her eyes moved without moving her head left, right, into the recessed doorway of a closed alterations shop. Then to the mouth of the alley between the shop and the old check cashing place that had been boarded up since the pandemic. 3 of them, they stepped out with the casual arrogance of people who had done this before and found it easy. Young men. Late teens, early 20s maybe. 2 of them were wearing hoodies pulled up against the still dry air. The third had a red bandana across the lower half of his face, which in the dim light of a struggling street lamp almost looked theatrical, like a costume rather than a choice. The one in front was the tallest. He moved with his hands already spread, a kind of performative looseness in his limbs that was meant to communicate control. He was chewing on something, gum maybe. He looked at Margaret the way a person looks at an object they've already decided the value of. "Bag," he said, just that, one word. The universal opening line of a street robbery that the person delivering it has said many times before and expects to work immediately. Margaret stopped walking. She did not step back. She did not clutch her bag. She stood exactly where she was, and her eyes moved across all 3 of them in a slow, professional assessment that took less than 2 seconds and told her everything she needed to know about the hierarchy between them. the confidence level of each one, and the specific quality of danger she was working with. Duke he simply sat down beside her left leg and looked at the tall one in the front. Not growling, not lunging, just looking. The way a thing looks at something it has already processed and filed. The tall one laughed. He looked back at his friends. "She got a dog," he said with the tone of someone who finds the idea mildly amusing. "That's cute." He took a step forward. "I'm going to say this once," Margaret said. Her voice was low. Not raised, not shaking. It had the quality of a room in which the temperature has been precisely set and will not be changing. "Walk away." The tall one stopped. Not from fear, not yet. From the small, instinctual confusion that occurs when the expected script doesn't run. He had expected crying. He had expected fumbling. He had expected the immediate, reflexive compliance that most people offer when confronted with threat and darkness, and the sudden arithmetic of 3 against 1. He had not expected that voice. "Lady, I'm not going to. I'm a trauma nurse," she said. "I have just finished 12 hours of watching people make decisions that cost them everything. I am tired in a way you cannot currently understand. And I am telling you clearly one time to walk away." The second one, shorter, hovering a half step behind and to the right, shifted his weight. He looked at the dog again. Duke hadn't moved. That was somehow worse than if the dog had been barking or straining at the leash. The stillness was unnatural. The stillness was the thing that made the short one's jaw tighten slightly. "The dog ain't on a short leash," he said to the tall one, his voice lower, careful. "So?" The tall one rolled his neck, snapped his gum. He reached into the front pocket of his hoodie. What happened next took 4 seconds. Duke did not bark. Duke did not lunge in the wild, theatrical way that dogs do in movies. He moved. He moved the way water finds a crack, with absolute economy, absolute commitment, and without a single wasted motion. The leash went from taut to slack to irrelevant in the same moment that 72 pounds of trained Belgian Malinois crossed the distance between sitting and impact. The tall one's hand barely cleared his pocket before he was on the ground. Duke had him by the forearm, grip locked, body weight applied, not shaking or tearing, just holding with the kind of permanent certainty that made the man understand, in the very specific language of pain and restraint, that the situation was over. He screamed. The second one took 2 steps forward and then stopped when Margaret moved. She had stepped into a stance that had nothing casual in it. Her left foot was back. Her weight was distributed. Her hands were up and her eyes were completely flat, not angry, not cold in a dramatic way. Just professionally empty in the way that eyes get when a person has moved entirely from their emotional mind into their operational one. It was the look she'd carried through 2 deployments with the 44th Medical Brigade. Through 3 months embedded with a forward surgical team in a province where the dust was orange and the helicopters never stopped. It was not a look the second one had ever seen on a woman in scrubs on Delmer Street at 11:15 at night. He stopped. The third one, the one with the bandana, who had been the quietest from the beginning, was already backing toward the alley. He had read the room faster than the others. He pulled his bandana down as he moved, and even in the bad light, his face had the expression of someone who had just understood something they wished they hadn't. "Duke," Margaret said. The dog released. He stepped back. He sat. He looked at the tall one on the ground the way he had looked at all 3 of them before, with that same measured, cataloging stillness that had nothing personal in it. The tall one was on his knees. He was holding his forearm. Nothing was broken. The skin was not torn. Duke had been trained with the same precision that military operations demand, controlled force, not destruction. The arm would bruise. The man would remember. That was the point. Margaret looked down at him. He was younger up close. She could see it now in the way the fear had wiped the performance from his face. Under the hoodie and the swagger and the practiced looseness, there was something much younger and much rawer. A face that still had the traces of a boy in it, even as it was trying so hard to be something harder. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not satisfaction, grief almost. The particular heavy grief of someone who works in a trauma ward and knows exactly how a night like this one can end, and knows exactly which rooms in the hospital those endings happen in, and has held more hands in those rooms than she can count. Get up, she said. He got up, slowly, still holding his forearm. His eyes moved to Duke and then away. Look at me, she said. He looked at her. How old are you? The question landed strangely. He blinked. What? How old? A pause, the kind of pause that happens when someone is trying to decide whether honesty is a trap. 19, he finally said. Margaret nodded slowly. She looked at the second one, who was still standing exactly where he had stopped, as if the ground beneath him had decided to hold him there. And you, he swallowed. 20, she looked toward the alley, but the third one was gone. She already knew he was gone. She looked back at the tall one, the one Duke had taken down, and something in her expression shifted. Not to warmth exactly, but to something adjacent to it, something that required more from the person receiving it than warmth does. I spent 8 years in the United States Army, she said. Nursing Corps. I have worked in field hospitals in places where the closest thing to an ambulance was a helicopter that might arrive in 20 minutes if the weather held. I have kept men alive with my hands in conditions that would end most people's ability to sleep at night. She paused. I came home. I kept working. I have been a trauma nurse for 17 years. I have seen every version of how a life ends too early. And I am standing here on this sidewalk at 11:15 at night because I work the shift that no one wants to work, to take care of people who need care. That is what I am. The tall one was not chewing his gum anymore. I'm not calling the police, Margaret said, not because I can't. Because I've been in this neighborhood long enough to know that a call like that ends in a way that doesn't serve anyone on this block. But I want you to hear me. She let the silence hold for a moment. Whatever brought you out here tonight, whatever the math was that made this feel like a solution, it isn't. It has never been. And the next person you try this with may not have the patience I'm choosing to have right now. The second one looked at the ground. His hands had come out of his hoodie pocket and were hanging at his sides, and something in his posture had changed entirely. The performed toughness had dissolved like sugar in rain. Duke tracked a wounded insurgent through 4 kilometers of hostile terrain in 2014, Margaret said. His handler didn't make it back from that deployment. I want you to understand what kind of animal you were about to challenge. She picked up the leash properly. Duke stood. She looked at them both one final time, and it was the kind of look that people remember. Not because it was frightening, though it had been that, but because it was honest. Completely and quietly honest in the way that very few looks ever are. Go home, she said. They went. She watched them until they turned the corner at the far end of Delmer Street. She stood there on the cracked sidewalk with the dry electric air sitting on everything and the laundromat rumbling quietly from across the street. She did not feel triumphant. She didn't feel the surge of adrenaline that some people describe after confrontation. She felt tired. She felt the 12-hour shift in her lower back and in the soft tissue behind her eyes. She felt it in her feet inside her scuffed nursing shoes and in the tendons of her right hand where it had gripped Duke's leash. She felt the weight of the moment not as victory, but as the particular heaviness that comes from looking directly at something sad and choosing to respond to it with something other than match. Sadness. She looked down at Duke. He looked back up at her with those amber eyes that had seen things that could not be explained in human vocabulary, and his tail moved once, a single slow arc. She exhaled. She started walking again. The remaining block and a half to her apartment building was exactly the same as it always was. The broken mailbox on the corner that the landlord had promised to fix for 9 months. The small memorial someone had made against a fire hydrant for a person she had never known, candles, a photograph, a faded ribbon. The smell of someone's late dinner drifting from a window above. Garlic and something fried. The sound of a television laugh track from somewhere behind glass. Ordinary things, the most important things always are. She got inside. She took the stairs because the elevator was slow, and she had never been a person who waited for things when walking was available. 3rd floor, apartment 3C. She put her key in the lock and turned it, and the familiar smell of her own home reached her. A specific combination of the candle she burned in the evenings, Duke's dry food smell. And something underneath it all that was just hers. The smell of her own particular life. She unclipped Duke's harness and set it on the hook by the door. He shook himself and walked to his water bowl and drank. She sat on the edge of the couch, not lying back, not fully sitting, just perching at the edge the way people do when they aren't ready to stop moving yet, but their body has already voted. She sat there for a long time. She thought about the tall one's face when the performance had fallen away. She thought about his age, 19. She thought about what 19 looked like in an emergency room, which she had seen more times than she wanted to count. She thought about whether he would go home and stay home or whether the night would pull him back out into itself. She couldn't control that. That was the hardest thing she had ever had to learn, in the army and in the hospital and in the long, quiet aftermath of both. You do what you can do. You do it with everything you have. And then the outcome belongs to the world, not to you. The world is not always fair with what it does with what you give it, but you give it anyway. Duke came from the kitchen and put his head on her knee. His eyes were half closed. She put her hand on his skull, the broad, warm dome of it, and she pressed gently and he pressed back. Outside, the rain finally came. She could hear it starting on the window glass. Soft at first, then building, the way things do when they've been held back long enough. It tapped and streaked, and the city outside her window went from that dangerous purple electric silence into something cleaner, something rinsed. She sat there with her hand on Duke's head, and she listened to the rain. And she didn't think about the next shift or the next 12 hours or the paperwork she still had to finish online before Friday. She didn't think about Portland or her daughter or the marriage that had ended the quiet way. She just listened. And in the listening, there was something that was not peace exactly, but was in the same family as peace. A settling. The way a building settles after the heat of the day releases, creaking, adjusting, finding its level again. She had spent her entire adult life being precisely what was needed in the worst possible moments. On the battlefield and in the ward and on a cracked sidewalk on Delmer Street at 11:15 at night. She had never asked for a ceremony about it. She had never needed one. The rain tapped on. Duke breathed slow and warm against her leg. And Margaret Acaffer, trauma nurse, veteran, mother, woman who walked the same 3 blocks every night in scuffed white shoes, sat in the soft dark of her apartment and let the world be exactly what it was, broken and painful, and full of 19-year-old boys making terrible decisions, and also full of rain at the end of a dry night and a dog who pressed back when you pressed him, and small memorial candles on fire hydrants for people no one remembers and garlic smell from someone's late window and the absolute, unshakable fact that tomorrow she would go back. She would always go back, not because she had to, because she understood in her hands and her spine and the deep marrow quiet of everything she had lived, that the ones who know how to hold the line are the ones who must, even on ordinary streets. Even in the dark, especially then,